former presidents have continued to actively serve this country, regardless of political orientation. Years in the White House tend to be one of the ultimate sacrifices. Yet this week, a former chief executive may have tendered as great a service to this nation as anyone in our past. The inclination to racism in this country still exists, said the 39th president, crystallizing a whispered fear, and it has again bubbled up to the surface. Our fourth story on the countdown, the right issues its predictable response, calling this president a Kenyan, a Muslim, comparing him to Hitler, depicting him as the homicidal joker or a witch doctor, all the while pretending to be talking about health care reform. President Jimmy Carter's remarks to NBC Nightly News bringing the discussion of racism to the center of this nation's discourse. He repeated some of those sentiments at a town hall at the Carter Center in Atlanta.
There is an inherent feeling among many people in this country that an African American ought not to be president and ought not to be given the same respect as if he were white. And the outbursts that we see, the scatological language, the sign that I saw on television last night, we should bury Obama with Kennedy, for instance. And Obama is a Nazi. Those kind of things are not just casual outcomes of a sincere debate over whether we should have a national program in health care or not.
The race to deny it's about race, led by the always ironic RNC chairman, Michael, this isn't about race, it's about policy. Steele offering this pearl of wisdom on former President Carter.
I think the president, with all due respect, is just plain wrong and quite frankly ignorant as to matters of race. If he thinks that what we heard in that chamber that evening was somehow stoked by or stems from racism, I think it's unnecessary. I think it colors, if you will, this debate on health care in a very unfortunate way.
He made a pun. In a written statement, Mr. Steele went on to note, this is a pathetic distraction by Democrats to shift attention away from the president's wildly unpopular government-run health care plan that the American people simply oppose. Mr. Steele also calling on the president to repudiate President Carter's comments. Meanwhile, the White House responding that the president does not believe that the criticism on health care is racially motivated. Commentary the morning after was putrid and impersonal and in some cases naive.
It's not just former President Jimmy Carter saying this, it's many members of Congress and other people, columnists here in the U.S., who are now race-baiting this whole topic. So it appears that this issue is not going to go away.
Jimmy Carter is a nation's hemorrhoid, folks, and we don't have a tube of Prep H big enough to deal with it.
As suggested earlier, we will defer to Mr. Limbaugh as an expert on that issue of anatomy. Time now to call in Melissa Harris Lacewell, Associate Professor of Politics and African American Studies at Princeton University. Our apologies for that problem, Professor. Thanks for your time.
No problem. I'll have to just start taking that train ride into New York and sitting at the table.
Back to President Carter, his remarks, the reaction to them today. The president grew up in the Jim Crow South. Is there something to be said about any Southern man aged 80 or above making these comments, whether he's a former president or not?
Well, I think there's something very powerful whenever white men, particularly Southern white men of a particular age, make this argument. In fact, you know, a big thank you to you and to President Carter, to people like the scholar Tim Wise and others who, as white men, have been very clear and very consistent about saying this is not about whites versus blacks or browns. This is about an impulse towards racism versus an impulse towards anti-racism. And I think that saying anti-racism really matters because it's not just a matter of being sort of neutral. It's a matter of actively pushing back against the forces in our country which are old, which are ugly, and which require us to call them out, call them by name, and root them out of the contemporary discourse.
You praised a speech about by President Johnson about the protests in Selma, and in doing so you wrote, "Racist attacks against the black president are tantamount to hollering fire in a crowded theater." Is that not what President Carter was getting at, and is that not also what the right does not understand about this whole debate, that there really isn't a little racism under these circumstances?
Yeah, I think what's critical here is that clearly people who are against health care reform are against health care reform. If we had Hillary Clinton as president, if we had John Edwards as president, there would be efforts against these presidents. It's even possible that some of the things we see, let's take George W. Bush. One of the most famous images that went around with Bush was an image of Bush turned into a chimpanzee, and it was kind of, George W. Bush is a dumb monkey, right? It was a, bad and awful thing to say about your president, but it wasn't racialized. If you take President Obama and turn him into an ape or a monkey, then what happens is you carry the whole history of race, racism, and the things that turned and thought of black people as apes, as monkeys, as animals. So you've got to recognize that you exist within a historical framework, and you have to say, okay, I have a point to get across, but I'm not allowed to do it in a way that reduces public discourse to the ugly history of American racism.
To deny that this is extant and in play, is it, as I suggested earlier, because people's livelihoods depend on enabling their viewers or their listeners to remain in denial over what they might actually feel, or is it something else?
Well, I think, to go back to this notion of feeling, that racism is about, like, I have this negative feeling in my stomach and I have to have it about all black people or all brown people. That's not racism, right? Racism is about deploying particular strategies against either an individual or a group that leads to greater inequality. And in this case, we have, the reality that you have an African-American president, that many of those who are most critical and most vocal are white people in a party that at one point made a choice to use race as a wedge issue in order to gain a foothold in the American South, which was the former Confederacy and which has an ugly racial history. That is the history of the Republican Party. They have a particular requirement to be careful on race because it was through race that they first gained power 40 years ago.
Previously, on many topics, this president has taken a minor controversy and turned it into something worth contemplating, worth analyzing, in particular on the issue of race itself. Is he missing an opportunity to take what seems like a central controversy and turn it into the same kind of thing by reacting the way he did to President Carter, to say through a spokesman that the White House doesn't believe that racism is a significant factor here?
Yeah, I guess I understand that the president is trying to pass health care, but there are these moments, I've heard people say that maybe what President Obama is doing is the rope-a-dope strategy of Muhammad Ali, laying back and taking the body blows to tire out the opposition so he can come in with a knockout. But one of the things that was true about Muhammad Ali is that when he saw racism, he always spoke to it. He always said it. It was part of what we loved about his brashness. I wish it was a little bit more Muhammad Ali in Barack Obama today.
Melissa Harris Lacewell of Princeton, great thanks, and great thanks for your patience.
Thanks.